famous scene from a very, very famous movie. This is Once Upon a Time in the West, Sergio Leone's 1968 masterpiece. Some of you might know him also as the director of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with Clint Eastwood, but this is really kind of his crowning achievement. Italian director who really, really took the form of the American Western seriously, was influenced by people like Howard Hawks and John Ford. But rather than kind of giving you these westerns where there was a lot of uplift and there was always a happy ending, Leone was really interested in exploring the genre as kind of a moral wasteland. There are no good people, everybody has blood on their hands. He assembled a really, really amazing cast for this film. You're going to see Peter Fonda in a very, very rare turn as a villain. You will see Charles Bronson pre-Death Wish days, although he still looks really, really craggy, playing the hero harmonica. Jason Robards is in this in kind of a comedic role, and as well as Claudia Cardinale, who incidentally did not speak any English, so her part is completely dubbed over by an American actress. So what we're going to be looking for here is what the visual language of the clip indicates to us. What can we read into the images that we're seeing? There's only one line of dialogue in this entire 9-minute clip. So as we're watching, I'm going to stop this periodically just to point some things out. The first thing that we can look at here, just in the very first frame, is this man in black. Now, this is Henry Fonda. And if we start the clip, very, very soon Charles Bronson enters the frame. Right off the bat, and we're going to be stopping this clip a whole lot, you will notice that Fonda's character here is dressed in black and that he is in the extreme background of the shot. Play it a little bit further along, and Charles Bronson enters. And Charles Bronson is wearing white. And we can ask right away, well, what do those colors tell us? We know this is a Western. We know that there are embedded cultural tropes that tell us that certain kinds of characters wear certain kinds of colors. So, the man in black is obviously going to be who? The answer is the villain. And the man in white is going to be who? The hero. Let's continue. Notice that this shot here, in comparison to the last shot, reverses the framing. In the last shot, Charles Bronson, our white hat, was the dominant figure in the frame, taking up basically a whole third of it, and now they've switched over to Peter Fonda, who's taking up his third of it. You'll also notice that Peter Fonda, when he takes up his big portion of the frame in this shot, is taking up the left side, or the sinister side. What this dual framing suggests, with each character taking up an equal portion of the frame in reverse shots, is that they are equally matched. As well, the music can tell you a little bit of something, as well as the movement of the actors. This is a scene with a very, very dynamic camera. The camera is constantly moving, constantly cutting. It's very, very restless. And if you just kind of read the motion of the camera and the circular motion of the actors, which starts right here, you can basically figure out that this is what part of the film. And the answer is, well, it's the climactic gunfight. It's the showdown between good and evil. But I also want to point out something color-wise. If you take a look at harmonica here, Charles Bronson's character, you will see that the shade of white he is wearing is not a perfect white. It's very, very dirty, and you can sort of say, well, why is he kind of wearing this off, dirty colored white? And one of the answers is, of course, well, look at their surroundings. They're in the desert. You wear white in the desert, you're going to end up looking pretty beige. But symbolically, we can also say that what's happening here is that Charles Bronson is being signified as a good guy who is maybe not that good of a guy. Maybe he has a past. Like I said, this is a film where everybody has blood on their hands no matter what. So Harmonica, our hero, is really more of an anti-hero, and you can tell that just by looking at his wardrobe. Once again, taking a look at that dynamic camera, the camera has panned out quite radically here so that both of the characters are dwarfed. And maybe what that's saying about the landscape here is that it doesn't care about this drama that's playing out at the human level. The landscape, in some ways, it's its own character. What Leone's commenting on here is that these people are on a very, very violent frontier, and it's not just the violence of human beings, it's also really the violence of nature. This landscape does not care about them, and ultimately it will kill both of them, probably. These are people, in the words of John Ford, who are way, way out on a limb. And the land itself is very, very indifferent to their conflict. This is basically just an establishing shot. We're kind of looking here at how far apart they are. This may be an emotional furtherness. This may be just basically to kind of tell you how the gunfight is going to take place, but it's really establishing the space that they're in as well. If you look over here on the right side, you have these skeletal trees. All around them, you have this signification of death. And of course, as a little visual joke, right there in the middle of the frame is an outhouse. These guys live in a world that is basically a toilet. Alright, Sergio Leone was a really accomplished visual stylist, probably one of the greatest framers of shots in the world. And here he is spending a little bit of time showing us Frank, Peter Fonda's character, taking off his coat and dropping it on the ground. So we have to ask, why use film? And they were shooting on film, not digital. Why use film on this shot? You might see a slight smile here on Charles Bronson's face. I don't know if he's squinting or if he really is smiling, but that does add something to his character. Also notice that Charles Bronson stays very, very stationary while Frank, like a predator, circles around him. Does that say something about character, motivation, or emotion? I'm sure that it does. Perhaps harmonica here, Charles Bronson, is the confident one, while Peter Fonda is the one who's actually nervous about how this whole gunfight is going to turn out. Notice also that he's blinking a whole lot. Maybe again the acting is telling us something about what's going on inside the characters, even though they're not conveying those emotions with words. All of a sudden, Frank checks the sky. Maybe Frank is nervous. Again, this completely stoic harmonica. Alright, so Frank at this point has stopped moving. I want to point out that we are 2 minutes into this gunfight, and there has been no gunfight. Obviously, tension is being built. It's classic tactic. Notice again how in the previous frame, harmonica basically dominated the image, while here Frank is very, very small. We even get a look at him physically, and he just kind of looks like a pudgy old man. Alright, again, dwarfed by the landscape. The music, this sort of operatic, very, very swelling tune written by the great Sergio Leone, who scored, or not Sergio Leone, Ennio Morricone, excuse me, who scored a lot of Leone's films, comes to a close. And so we think, well, now that the music has died down, they're going to have to fight, right? Alright, let's take a look back at this jacket. Again, I said Sergio Leone was a really, really accomplished stylist. Did somebody make a mistake and just forget that the jacket was there in the dirt and frame this shot all wrong? Or is the jacket there for a purpose? Well, it does a couple of things. Notice how the line here sort of seems to magnify from harmonica up to Frank, meaning that the force of this encounter is coming from this side of the frame. And if you look really, really hard at the jacket on the ground, maybe if you squint a little bit, it might start to look like something. Now, your first reaction is probably going to be, oh, that's a cat. But we have to rule that out, because why would there be a cat in the frame? That doesn't symbolize anything. But if you squint really, really hard, and if you thought about coming up on that in this basically off-white background, you might think that that looks a whole lot like a dead body lying on the ground. Now, I may be out on a limb here, but I think I'm right. So we kind of have to ask ourselves, is this foreshadowing Frank's death? Is Leone leaving us clues visually to indicate how this fight is going to turn out? Alright, and again, notice that motion. Alright, it's all coming from this direction. Harmonica is striding up to Frank really, really confidently and closing that distance between them. Classic gesture, revealing the gun. This is, of course, going to be a fight. And we're still asking, we are 2.5 minutes into this, where is the gunfight? Alright, now we get the camera drawing in on Bronson's face. He is craggy, he's not conventionally handsome. We have to ask, well, why are we going to focus on this guy? And if you just kind of think about your knowledge of film grammar, whether it's been formal or whether you just kind of picked it up by watching a bunch of movies, you know, of course, that zeroing in on somebody's face at a moment of tension usually signals one thing. So let's keep watching. And the answer, of course, is that when you zero in on somebody's face, and we're going to see it zero in more specifically on his eyes in just a minute, you get a flashback. Okay, so we're finally going to fill in the backstory of these two characters. Why do they want so badly to kill each other? Here he is mirroring the image that we saw earlier, a nervous Frank looking at the sun to check the light. He doesn't want it to be in his eyes when he takes his shot. But here he is, much younger, wearing a pretty bad wig, smirking and checking the light. So we kind of have to ask, what's changed in his character that goes from this to kind of that doddering old man that we saw earlier? The music here, of course, is a harmonica, mirroring what is going on with Frank here. He's pulling a harmonica out of his pocket, and we know, of course, that our hero is named Harmonica. So we're beginning to establish the roots of their relationship and the hatred between them. We go back briefly to our previous timeline. We're going kind of deeper into harmonica's memories here. And you can see this signified visually by the fact that the camera pulls in much, much tighter on his face and eventually on his eyes, which are kind of the only colorful thing in this entire scene.
Keep your loving brother happy.
Alright, so now we've established the relationship, and this maybe had to be done through dialogue, although I think maybe it was a little bit of laziness on Leone's part. Frank says, keep your loving brother happy. Okay, so whose brother? Well, based on the fact that we zeroed in on harmonica's eyes, we can assume that the perspective we're getting now, directly looking at Frank, is that of harmonica. So we know that the relationship between Frank and harmonica has to do with harmonica's brother, and this plays out in a really, really vivid and really, really horrifying way in the next couple of shots. Right, because we've established that the perspective here is a young harmonicas, we know now that this kid here is, of course, harmonica. So that's how he got his name, and we see here that harmonica really, really filling the frame, so passive that he won't even spit out this, little mouth harp that Frank has forced him to kind of put between his teeth, is here, and then this is obviously a boot. So what's going on? And again, Leone uses this really, really dynamic camera to reveal the full horror of this scene. Again, very, very, very slow. There's so much tension building up here. That weird kind of electric guitar, clangy, Western-sounding score is just ramping things up for us. Little piece of film history here. Back in the background, you're going to see Monument Valley, which was the setting of so many Westerns throughout the 50s and 60s. Most famously used by John Ford in The Searchers, which is another kind of anti-Western. It's a very, very depressing, kind of nihilistic piece of filmmaking. I don't know if this is actually a matte painting or whether they actually went out to Monument Valley to film this, but any aficionado of Westerns would know that they are shooting this very, very anti-Western in a very, very kind of classical, iconic Western spot. I want you also to notice the behavior here of Frank's cohorts, of his henchmen. Two of them are leaning very casually on a wall. One of them right here is just basically taking a nap. And what that says about their characters, of course, is that for them, this kind of atrocity, not to mention an atrocity in the shadow of an abandoned church, an abandoned and destroyed church, so that says something about where God fits into this landscape. He's not present. He's not here to save you. This is the remains of that institution. For these guys here, these criminals, hanging a guy by making him stand on his brother's feet from an old church bell isn't out of the ordinary. For them, this is just Tuesday. And you can just sort of think about the horror of this scene. Here's the older brother who is being balanced on his younger brother's shoulder, and it's only a matter of time until the younger brother's knees give out, basically putting the guilt of his brother's death on him. Frank is sort of an almost jokerish figure here, just this almost hysterical evil in his actions, and he's obviously enjoying it. We can tell that from his face in the previous shots. And we're about to get a really interesting kind of bit of non-sound sound mixing here, so I want to pay really close attention to these next few shots. Alright, and if we go back and take a look at this guy here, just a few frames back, I'm probably going to miss it, but we'll just go ahead and rebound here. Alright, so if you're an art historian or you took an art history class, what you might notice here is the grotesqueness of the faces of Frank's henchmen. They remind me a little bit of Hieronymus Bosch, who painted several passion scenes. This reminds me not, coincidentally, of a Hieronymus Bosch painting that was about sort of the flogging of Jesus with these sort of very, very bulbous noses and messed up teeth and these looks of violent glee on the faces of the people who were persecuting Jesus. And if I wasn't trying to do this so quickly, I would probably intercut the painting that I'm thinking of here. But I think that's what Leone is calling back to. This was a guy who knew a lot about classical art and a lot about how to frame an image. The biblical references keep coming, by the way, so let's keep watching. Alright, we get this really, really random shot of a guy eating an apple. And we can ask ourselves about the symbolism of apples, of course. Hopefully anybody who grew up in the West, regardless of whether or not they're a Christian, will know, of course, that apples symbolize sin. And so maybe that's what's going on here, and I certainly think that's part of it, but let's keep watching. Alright, we get this now sort of silent dialogue here. I'm not a lip reader, so I don't know what he's saying. But we get the sense that his last words are perhaps a desperate plea for mercy, or to at least leave his little brother out of it. And let's keep our eyes on the apple, folks. Alright, this is really important because this is such a sophisticated piece of editing that unless I explain it really, really closely, people might not get it. So we get the guy with the apple earlier on, and then we come back down here. The moment of the brothers hanging is intercut with this very, very strange shot of the guy biting the apple. So why is that in there? And there's a really interesting answer here. You have to ask yourself, well, what sound does an apple make when you bite into it? And the answer, of course, is, well, it crunches. And then you kind of have to ask yourself, well, based on the previous shot, what sound does a neck make when it's broken because the person who owns that neck has just been hanged? And the answer, of course, is a crunch. So what Leone has done here is really clever, all right? He's taken this visual and actually added some subconscious sound to it. The crunching of the apple is meant to bring into our mind the sound of a neck that is being broken. So let's watch that again and just keep that crunching sound in mind. Part of me thinks that he did this to get around the censors. In 1968, it would have been really, really hard to get it past the moral code people or the production code people and basically say, hey, I'm going to have on my soundtrack the sound of a guy's neck snapping. So he does that visually via the inferred sound of the apple. Alright, watch the way that the kid falls. The young harmonica falls in this very, very specific position on his side, his face in the dust. And as we reach the climax of the scene, that image is going to be mirrored. And this is the great thing about this scene, is that we spend 6 minutes and more working up to this climactic instance where these two guys are finally going to shoot at each other, and the gunfight is over in a split second. And what's even better about this, what's so clever and so kind of darkly funny, is the look on Frank's face. Frank is completely surprised that he lost. This is a guy who's never lost in his lifetime. This is a guy who's always been the one to do the killing. And all of a sudden you have this look of revelation come over his face in this just split second. Oh my gosh, I've finally been beaten. How did this happen? All right, this is a great piece of nonverbal acting by Fonda. We cut briefly to the secondary characters here, another little piece of sound editing. They're obviously not in the same space as Frank and Harmonica, but they clearly heard the gunshot. You have Claudia Cardinale having this look of dismay on her face, whereas Jason Robards here, who is really hamming it up for the camera, obviously was so startled by the gunshot that he cut himself shaving. So just a little kind of joke before the true climax of the scene. That shot right there is such a great indicator that Frank has finally lost. You know that he's not going to raise his gun again. You know that he's beaten because he's so out of it that he can't even holster his pistol. He can't even really truly surrender. He's just that beaten. Again, this look of just complete shock on his face. How could this have happened to me? You'll notice how the camera is shooting him from a low angle so that you're looking up at him, this sort of giant man, and then that switches really, really abruptly. So camera's looking up at him, camera's looking up at him. He's still dominant in some sense. You know where he's wounded now, right in the heart. Stumbles, low camera angle still. And then the camera gradually shifts up, and now the dominant person in the frame, the one that we're being forced to look up to, is Harmonica. Notice how earlier on in the scene there was no background noise. Okay, these two men are alone in the desert, but suddenly, as Frank, who is this agent of destruction and wildness and chaos, is finally being brought to his knees, you start to hear the sounds of civilization in the background. That's the sound of the railroad being built. Perhaps this wilderness is being tamed one man at a time. The more people like Frank that are taken out of the world, the easier it is for civilized society to progress. There's the second line of dialogue, "Who are you?" And of course, Harmonica, in kind of keeping with the wordless nature of the scene, answers him wordlessly, and Frank understands. There's the iconic harmonica. Notice the twin motion in the previous scene where Frank sort of pulled it out of his pocket. Now Harmonica is pulling it out of his shirt. He's essentially mocking Frank with Frank's earlier actions. Again, exact mirror image of what Frank did earlier. Okay, and remember how I told you to think about how young Harmonica fell on the ground, on his side, his face in the dirt. Well, that action is about to be mirrored too. Harmonica's revenge is really, truly coming full circle here. He's doing exactly to Frank what Frank did to him in some ways. And just in case you didn't get it, Leone is going to cut back to it to kind of say, "Hey, look at what I'm doing. I'm mirroring the previous shots here." And Frank, this arch villain, this really, really kind of psychotic, sociopathic killer who enjoys killing, suddenly finds himself in the dirt with this really, really stupid look on his face. So it's as if Leone is trying to say, look at the big man, look at how ridiculous he is now. I mean, he's not even given the dignity of not making a stupid face as he dies.